If you turn in your Bibles to Matthew chapter 22, we're picking up from where we left off last week. Remember that scene of where some disciples of the Pharisees, together with some of the Herodians, teamed together to try to foil Jesus by bringing him the test. You know, is it right to pay the poll tax to Caesar? We remember that, and Jesus said, well, show me the coin that's used for paying the poll tax. And they brought him in a denarius, and he asked them, whose likeness is on the coin? We remember that. Caesar's, of course, they answered. Then render to Caesar what is Caesar, and to God what is God's. And he foiled their plot. And so that we ended off on verse 22 last week, and we're picking up in verse 23 today. And Matthew writes, on that day, that same day, some Sadducees, who say there is no resurrection, came to Jesus and questioned him. They didn't even believe in the resurrection. Asking, Teacher, Moses said, if a man dies having no children, his brother as next of kin shall marry his wife and raise up children for his brother. Now there were 7 brothers with us. And the first married and died, and having no children, left his wife to his brother. So also the second and the third, down to the 7th, of course, implied in that is the 4th, 5th, and 6th as well, right? And last of all, the woman died. In the resurrection, therefore, whose wife, remember, they don't even believe in the resurrection. In the resurrection, therefore, whose wife of the 7 will she be? For they all had married her. But Jesus answered and said to them, you're mistaken, not understanding the Scriptures nor the power of God. For in the resurrection they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven. But regarding the resurrection of the dead, have you not read what was spoken to you by God? I am the God of Abraham, I am the God of Isaac, God of Jacob. He's not the God of the dead, but of the living. When the crowds heard this, they were astonished at his teaching. So since RCB launched more than 12 years ago, it's been one of my great joys is to pastor RCBC together with Pastor Keith. And I'm sure he says the same thing. After all the years that we've spent pastoring elsewhere, it's one of my true joys to pastor with Keith. I mean, if you total up the number of years that he and I have spent pastoring here and other churches, we have over 80 years of experience between the two of us. Over 80 years. And there have been many joys caring for you as believers, others, and there's also been many sorrows. And some of those sorrows for us is that when someone under our care passes away and goes to be with the Lord. And there have been many. There have been many through the years. But for believers who are experiencing death, it's the reality of the resurrection. Resurrection that gives us courage and hope. Isn't it? I mean, as the Apostle Paul told the Corinthians, he said, we do not lose heart. But though our outer man is decaying, yet our inner man is being renewed day by day. For we know that if the earthly tent, that's this body, which is our house, is torn down, we die, we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. Likewise, it was the reality of the resurrection that bolstered suffering Job. I don't know if you remember in the Old Testament, Job said in chapter 19, verse 26, he said, even after my skin is destroyed, yet from my flesh I shall see God. My flesh, my body, as he said. But not everyone has resurrection of hope, of course. Not everyone does, right? For many people, this life is all that they think that there is. Bill Falloon, who was one of the founders of the Life Extension Foundation, will not fly anywhere on a jet without wearing his asbestos-lined helmet so that in the event of the crash of the jet, his head could be removed and cryonically frozen, and that somewhere down the line he would be able to be brought back to life. As he says, when people see him wearing that helmet, he said, it's nice, it's a secure feeling. I can't understand why everyone else doesn't do it. Woody Allen doesn't seem to have resurrection hope also when he says, it's not that I'm afraid to die. I just don't want to be there when it happens. That's Woody Allen. A number of years ago, in preparation for a Easter Sunday message, I was going to preach on the resurrection. I scheduled an appointment with Dr. Marvin Abs, who taught human anatomy at Shasta College. Did you have him, Charity? You didn't have him, Marvin Abs. I guess he was just a professor that the students feared because his tests and everything were so difficult. But anyway, I scheduled an appointment with him, and I specifically wanted to interview him and hear from him what happens in a person's body, what happens in a human body the moment that their heart stops beating. I wanted to hear just some technical explanation from him, and he went through some things within 2 to 4 minutes after their heart stops beating. Some of the, much of the specialized tissue within a person's body, such as brain neurons, begin to die. And that's why it's so important to get someone breathing again if they've stopped breathing, if their heart has stopped. Within 2 to 4 hours, he explained, a good many cells within the body may last that long without the normal feedback going on within the body. As a result of that, that's when they want to do organ extractions so that they can transplant a person's organs within a couple of hours after a person has died. Many of the cells within the body will live for quite a while, but within 24 hours, generally speaking, most of the cells within a body die. Some of the skeletal cells of a person's body will live. But it's then, after 24 hours, the digestive enzymes which are present within the cells of our body will begin to ingest that person's cell. And so I heard all of these things as he went through them with me, and at the end of it I said, now Dr. Apps, I'm preparing to preach this Sunday, and maybe you know that the Bible puts forward the reality of the resurrection from the dead, that Jesus, after being in the tomb for 3 days, literally rose from the dead. And I asked him, what do you think about that? I just kind of left it to him. And he looked at me, he gave me this kind of look, like, buddy, you haven't been listening to me. There is no passing go. There is no collecting $200. He gave me one of those kind of looks. But he didn't say that. But what he did say was, based upon what I explained to you, it couldn't happen. That's it. As far as I know, to this day, he is a total naturalist, a man who doesn't believe in, doesn't allow for the supernatural intervention of God, and therefore he has no hope beyond this life in the event that he even dies. No hope. Within our next section within Matthew's Gospel, we see Jesus under attack from yet another group on this particular Wednesday. And these guys are attacking Jesus with the idea of the truth of resurrection being the main thing that they are bringing him to think about, right? And what a day that Wednesday must have been. I mean, remember, as we said last week, this was Jesus last week there at Jerusalem before he was going to be crucified on that Friday. He entered Jerusalem on Monday. He was back to cleanse the temple on Tuesday. And then he was back at the temple to engage in debate, and as he was attacked by the religious leaders on Wednesday. And Matthew has shown us, beginning in chapter 21, verse 23, members of the Sanhedrin demanded of him, they came and they said, by what authority do you do these things? And Jesus countered their attack by his own question. He says, I'll tell you by what authority I do those things if you tell me regarding John's baptism. Is it from heaven? Is it from God? Well, they wouldn't answer it, right? And Jesus replied, neither will I answer your question by what authority I do this. We saw last week, they were again attacking him regarding this question of the poll tax. Again, the Pharisees teaming together, the disciples of the Pharisees teaming together with some Herodians. I mean, they were enemies, as we saw last week. The old saying was true, though, regarding the enemy of my enemy is my what? Friend. And so they joined together to attack Jesus regarding the poll tax. But again, Jesus foiled their plan. Render to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God. I mean, you and I might laugh at those knuckleheads. And they were knuckleheads. But we've got to realize that what was going on that day was spiritual warfare of the most intense kind. It really was. Their design on Jesus was diabolical. And their carefully constructed and thought out questions that they brought to him seemed innocent on the surface. They seemed benign, but they were intended to either embroil him with the Romans or discredit him in the eyes of the people. That was their intent, so keep that in mind. And so next in line comes this group of Sadducees, verse 23. And they come with this convoluted tale of this poor woman who goes through these 7 different guys, all of them marrying her and ending up afterwards with the question, whose wife is she going to be? Well, first of all, let's answer the question, who were the Sadducees? You probably know a few things about the Sadducees. The Pharisees are mentioned at least 4 or 5 times as many times within the Gospels as the Sadducees. I think the Pharisees are mentioned some 97 times. Sadducees mentioned some 14 times. And so the Pharisees are mentioned much more often in the Gospels than the Sadducees were. And while the Sadducees were few in number, they were essentially a group of rich Jewish aristocrats who had come to dominate the priesthood at the highest level within the Sanhedrin. And they had become a class unto themselves based upon what they considered their hereditary connection to Zadok the priest, who was high priest during the time of King David. So they thought because they were connected to Zadok, kind of gave them privilege and their place. You remember that Annas and Caiaphas were both Sadducees. They were both chief priests. And even though that there were many more Pharisees than there were Sadducees, the Sadducees had still come to hold majority number on the Sanhedrin. So they held sway over the thing. That tells you about him. And Annas, of course, Annas was in control of the marketeers there at the temple who were selling the animals and doing the money exchange. So that was, that whole thing was given the nickname of Annas' Bazaar. It really was. So that just tells you a little bit about their prominence. What about their politics? Well, they were similar to the Herodians. You remember last time we said that the Herodians were really in cahoots with the Romans, and the Sadducees were really, they got along fine with the Romans. The Romans helped undergird their position of power. And while the Pharisees and the Zealots hated the Romans, they wanted to see the Romans driven out of the promised land, Sadducees, again, they worked with them. And the Romans, as a result, gave them huge license to operate as they saw fit. So, if you were the common person who lived in Israel, you would have disdained the Sadducees like you disdained the Herodians, because not only did they corrupt the religious system, and you had to pay out the nose to be a part of the worship that went on there at the temple, but again, they were collaborating with your worst enemies, the Romans, who were the occupying force there within the land, right? And so, I think you get the picture a little bit about that. Now, what about their preaching? What did these guys believe? Well, the thing that really, let me just back up. On the one hand, you could say that the Sadducees were conservatives. You could say that they were conservatives, that they believed in a very literal, strict interpretation of the scriptures. They were much more rigid as far as applying Old Testament law and rejecting oral tradition and what they considered to be the traditions of the Pharisees. But the thing about the Sadducees, they only held that the first 5 books of the Bible, that is the Pentateuch, were authoritative. And everything else could be discarded. So they only believed in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Right? So that was, but they were kind of conservative in that. On the other hand, they were ultra-liberal. They were ultra-liberal. The centerpiece of their teaching, their belief, was a rejection of what? The resurrection. You see it right there in verse 23. Matthew tells us, we see it in parentheses, who say that there is no resurrection. And because they believed that the Pentateuch did not teach the resurrection, they rejected the idea of resurrection and life beyond the grave with a vengeance. They denied it. Isn't it amazing? It's amazing to me always how that someone could be considered very religious and yet they can deny the resurrection. How many Methodist pastors and ministers I've interacted with through the years, they deny resurrection, but they still are very religious. But the Sadducees believed that the Pentateuch did not teach resurrection. And that makes, again, this makes it easy to remember their name because they didn't believe in the resurrection. That's why they were so Sadducee. How many of you have never heard that before? How many have heard of it 100 times? Yeah, I know. Me too. So they didn't believe in the resurrection, and as a result of their not believing in the resurrection, they didn't believe that there was really any kind of afterlife. They didn't believe that there was really going to be rewards after death or punishment after death. So therefore, that changed their whole view about life, that life was all about getting as much as you could get while you could get it. The one with the most toys at the end when they die wins. That was their mindset. It really was. So they were your consummate naturalists who denied the supernatural. Turn over real quick to Acts chapter 23. You see there the situation that Luke tells us when Paul the apostle was brought before the Sanhedrin to be tried before them. And he knew that he wasn't going to get a fair trial in their midst. And looking at verses 6 through 8 of Acts chapter 23, again, Luke says, again, Paul is there on trial, but perceiving that one group were Sadducees and the others Pharisees, Paul began crying out in the council, "Brethren, I'm a Pharisee, a son of Pharisees. I'm on trial for the hope and resurrection of the dead." Notice that. He's poking. He's poking him. And as he said this, there occurred a dissension between who? The Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. For the Sadducees say that there is no resurrection, nor an angel, nor a spirit. They didn't believe in spiritual beings, but the Pharisees acknowledged them all, and this big argument broke out. Okay? So that kind of gives you a little bit of understanding about these guys. Now, even though the Pharisees and the Sadducees were poles apart in their belief, they were in agreement about one thing, and that is that Jesus had to go. Jesus had to go. You know, maybe we wonder, why did they hate Jesus so much? Why did the Pharisees and the Sadducees hate Jesus so much? Well, the answer to that question really is apparent, because the Sadducees were all for maintaining the status quo. Don't rock the boat. Just keep things going as they've gone for centuries. You know, we want to make the Romans happy. We'll just keep extracting money from the people regarding the whole sacrificial system. They didn't want the boat rocked. And so they didn't want any kind of popular messianic movement taking place. And so when Jesus came riding into Jerusalem on that Monday to this wave, this groundswell of popular support where everyone is crying out, "Hosanna, Hosanna," they panicked. They were panicking. And when Jesus came in and he cleared the temple on Tuesday, hitting them where they really drew so much of their money, when he hit them at that place, well, we got to know that deep, hot resentment became mixed with panic. John tells us in his gospel, turn over to chapter 11 of John. John tells us this. It was right about this same time. Right about this same time, verse 47 of John chapter 11. Therefore the chief priests, this is just shortly after Jesus' raising of Lazarus from the dead, therefore the chief priests and the Pharisees convened a council and saying, what are we doing? For this man is performing many signs, and if we let him go on like this gives you a flavor of why they were panicking. If we let him go on like this, all men will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation. See the connection there with the Romans. But one of them, Caiaphas, a Sadducee, remember that? High priest, who was high priest that year, said to them, you know nothing at all, nor do you take into account that it is expedient for you that one man die for the nation or for the people, and that the whole nation not perish. And that next verse is insightful as well. But you again, you get a sense, why were they so alarmed regarding Jesus? Well, he was a threat to their whole system. He really is. So the Sadducees gather together and they come to Jesus with this tale of this woman who is married to this group of 7 brothers. Each of the brothers dying until she herself died. And the question that you can see in verse 28, in the resurrection, which they didn't believe anyways, whose wife of the 7 will she be? For they all had married her. Now we got to wonder, was this an actual situation that they came and they asked him about, or was this hypothetical? Well, while Matthew records them saying there were 7 brothers with us, I would have to say it's almost certain that this was a hypothetical, kind of a constructed thing that they put together, because if you're the 4th brother in this line of brothers, are you going to get married to your brother's widow? You've seen husband number 1 dies, number 2, number 3. You probably wonder, is she poisoning the soup or what's going on here, right? So it's most certainly a hypothetical situation. I thought about titling this teaching, One Unlucky Woman, but I decided upon One Bride for 7 Brothers. Kind of a slight, do you remember the musical, 1954 musical entitled 7 Brides for 7 Brothers? Kind of a takeoff of that. Anyway, what we need to keep in mind is that verse 24, what they came and they said to Jesus was an approximate quote of Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 5, where God commanded that if a man took a wife and he died without having a male child, the man's brother was to take his brother's wife as his own and bear a son with her. And this command was referred to as levirate law. The Latin word lever has the idea of means husband's brother. It became known as levirate law. And maybe you wonder, why would God command such a thing? Why would the Old Testament command for one brother to take his brother's widow and sire a son with her? Well, Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 6 says this, quote, "It shall be that the firstborn whom she bears shall assume the name of his dead brother, so that the name will not be blotted out from Israel." That's the reason. It was a very gracious purpose on God's part so that the name, the lineage of a particular brother would not just completely disappear if he was to die, you see, but that he would have heirs which would live beyond him. Now you got to ask the question, well, is this something that we ever see happen within the Old Testament, where one brother takes the wife of his deceased brother? Well, yes, we do see that. You see it in Genesis chapter 38. Do you remember the story of Tamar, who became wed, first of all, to the man and God took him because did something wrong, and his brother Onan ended up taking Tamar, his wife, and I won't describe what he did. God bumped him off as well. He was a bad dude. And the story goes along, and Judah, the father-in-law, ends up taking her himself and producing a child. And I think Perez was the child that, there was another one. What was Perez's twin brother's name? Come on, all of you Bible scholars out there. I can't remember his name just right off the top of my head. But Perez was the one who was included within the Messianic line going all the way to Jesus, you see. But besides that, there's also the beautiful love story out of the book of Ruth, which is somewhat based upon Levirate law. You remember when Ruth, the Moabitess, became married to the Jewish fellow Mahlon, while they were over there in Moab country, and Mahlon ended up dying, and the story goes on to where Ruth and Naomi come back into Israelite territory, come to Bethlehem, and then you have the love story of Boaz, who ends up taking Ruth as a wife for himself. And Boaz was a relative of Mahlon. So there was kind of a fulfillment of Levirate law within that situation, and also there was the continuation of the ones who would be part of the Messianic line. So it's an amazing story. Now, what was given as a gracious command by God, the Pharisees twisted into this tale of seven brothers with one bride. Why did they concoct this tale? Why did they put this together? Well, the purpose was, their intent was to embroil Jesus in this unsolvable dilemma as far as whose wife is she going to be in the hereafter. In other words, discredit Jesus in the eyes of the people. Because Jesus had already clearly taught upon the subject of the resurrection. In John chapter 5, verses 28 and 29, John tells us, Jesus said, "For an hour is coming in which all who are in the tombs will hear his voice, Christ's voice, and will come forth. Those who have did the good to a resurrection of life, and those who have committed the evil to a resurrection of judgment." So Jesus had clearly taught upon the subject of resurrection. And yet they were in opposition to the idea of resurrection. And so their intent in bringing this concocted tale to Jesus was to create this situation which we would refer to in debating terms as reductio ad absurdum. Reductio ad absurdum. That is, to take an assertion, such as this woman who is married to the seven brothers, whose wife is she going to be in the hereafter, to show that it is just not possible for the resurrection to occur. Because you would have a situation in such a situation where she couldn't be anyone's wife. She couldn't be the wife of all seven. Okay? So it's the approach that they were taking was try to take the idea of the resurrection and show that it's just not possible. I think that Marvin Apps probably would have really bought into that kind of a thing. Just not possible. And so they thought that they had Jesus. They thought they had him. But Jesus' answer to them was as quick and as simple as it was insightful and devastating to their argument. While they had approached Jesus with guile and deception, they came to him, teacher, teacher. These guys were snakes. Jesus responded to them directly and to the point. Look at verse 29. Again, Jesus answered and said to them, "You're mistaken." Wrong. You don't know what you're talking about, as he says there. "You're mistaken, not understanding the scriptures, nor the power of God." You don't know what you're talking about. It was a colossal put down of these guys. Now, not going in the exact order that Jesus replied to them, I want you to notice, first of all, how that they did not understand the teaching of the scriptures. Look at verses 31 and 32 again. Jesus said, "But regarding the resurrection of the dead, have you not read what was spoken to you by God? I am the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob." He's not the God of the dead, but of the living. What I want you to notice first about what Jesus said there, Jesus is not referring, he didn't pull out some isolated text, some hidden text of the scriptures that, was some kind of an obscure thing. No. He went right to the heart. There was probably no better text known to these guys than how God revealed himself to Moses there in Exodus chapter 3, which that's a quote from. When God revealed himself to Moses from the burning bush, Exodus chapter 3, verse 6, he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Now, it's true, there are certainly other places in the Old Testament that clearly talk about the idea of resurrection. In Psalm chapter 16, verse 10, David said, for you will not abandon my soul to Sheol, nor will you allow your Holy One to undergo decay. Daniel chapter 12, verse 2 also says, many of those who sleep in the dust of the ground will awake, these to an everlasting life, but the others to disgrace and everlasting contempt. So there are other places in the Old Testament that clearly teach resurrection. But remember, the Sadducees only held to what as being authoritative? The Pentateuch. They only held to the first 5 books of the Old Testament as being authoritative to take their teaching. And so this was a primary text that Jesus took from the Pentateuch, which was right under their noses, which clearly spelled out that there is resurrection. Now Jesus referring to that text, Jesus referring to that verse, turns upon what? What is it within that verse that the idea of resurrection turns? It's the present tense verb of God saying, I am. I am the God of your father. I am the God of Abraham. I am the God of Isaac. I am the God of Jacob. Present tense, not past tense. Even though all 3 of those guys, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, had died hundreds of years before. I mean, God still said to Moses, I am the God. Now, I couldn't help thinking of, if someone came to me today and said, hey, Barry, I'm good friends with your father. I would have to say, well, you're mistaken because my dad died 20 years ago. So you're not good friends with my dad presently. You were a good friend of my dad, maybe. But you see what God is saying to Moses on that day. I am. I am. This is core of Jesus' very argument for the reality of the resurrection, and it turns upon a verb tense. Isn't that something? It tells us, it shows us once again the importance of the inspiration of the Scriptures. That the inspiration of the Scriptures, goes right down even into verb tenses and particular words that God inspired these things to be written. And as Jesus argued for the reality of the resurrection, the truth is those who belong to God like Charlie Kirk, those who belong to God like Vodi Bakum, the moment that their heart stops beating, what? Translated right into the presence of God. Right there. Not only did those Pharisees or those Sadducees not understand the Scriptures, they didn't understand the power of God. I mean, that's something that Dr. Marvin Apps clearly didn't understand. Didn't understand the reality of the power of God. All that Apps could think about was just at the moment of a person's heart stopped beating, the enzymes begin digesting, and just the process of decomposition begins, and there's nothing beyond that. It's done. That's all he could see. But Jesus, as he said to those Sadducees on that day, you don't understand the power of God. The word that is used there is dunamis in the Greek, and of course you know this, it's the word from which we get dynamite. The power of God is able to bring back a completely decomposed corpse from the dead. Jeremiah the prophet exclaimed this. He said in chapter 32, verse 17, Ah, God, behold, you have made the heavens and the earth by your great power and by your outstretched arm. Nothing is too difficult for you. Nothing's too difficult. And I think this is so true, isn't it, that when people don't believe in the resurrection, it oftentimes can be connected to their lack of understanding of the very power of God to bring something out of nothing, literally. We're reminded of that group of scientists who got together and decided that man had come so far, being able to clone life, that they no longer needed God. They no longer needed God. So they picked one scientist to go and to tell God that they were done with him. And this scientist walked up to God and said, God, we've decided that we no longer need you. We're to the point where we can clone people and we can do many miraculous things. So why don't you just go on and get lost? And God listened very patiently and kindly to the man. And after the scientist was done talking, God said, well, very well. This is how we'll do it. Let's just have a little man-making contest. To which the scientist replied, okay, great. And God said, now we're going to do this like we did it back in the old days of Adam. And the scientist said, sure, no problem. And he bent down and he went to grab himself a handful of dirt. And God looked at him and said, now, oh, wait a minute. You go get your own dirt. In other words, God created the dirt. He can create dirt out of nothing. And he can create man from dirt. And that's just the thing. The God who has the power to set the billions of stars in their place and the galaxies certainly has the power to resurrect a human body, which he created in the first place. Paul told the Philippians this in Philippians 3:21. He said, the Lord Jesus Christ will transform the body of our humble state into conformity with the body of his glory by the exertion of the power that he has even to subject all things to himself. Power. And I love the way, this is a bit of 17th century poetry. This is from John Dene. I've used this quote many times. I'm thrilled by it. Just listen very closely to it, okay? Humor. The word that he uses here for humor has the idea of a particle or just a part. He said this. Listen. One humor of our dead body produces worms. And those worms suck and exhaust all other humor. And then all dies and molders into dust. And that dust is blown into the river, and the puddled water tumbled into the sea. And that ebbs and flows in infinite revolutions. And still God knows in what cabinet every seed pearl lies, in what part of the world every grain of every man's dust lies. And he whispers, he hisses, he beckons for the bodies of his saints. And in the twinkling of an eye, that body that was scattered over all the elements is set down at the right hand of God in a glorious resurrection. Folks, that's power. God possesses that power. The last thing we want to touch on here is just the nature of the resurrection that we see Jesus giving in verse 30. For in the resurrection they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven. I mean, people have a great interest as far as, okay, there is resurrection. If there's going to be eternal life, what's it going to be like? What's it going to be like? I mean, how is our body that is to be going to compare with this present body? I mean, Paul gives us some things in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. Remember, Paul tells us a number of the differences that there will be between this body and our future body. This body is perishable. That one will be imperishable. As he says, this body is dishonorable. That body will be glorious. He also says that this body is weak. The body that is to be will be raised in power. This one's a natural body, and the body to come will be a spiritual body. But of course, as Jesus indicates, there will be certain differences. In the resurrection, they will neither marry nor be given in marriage, but will be like angels in heaven. Now, again, keep in mind, this affirmation of Jesus regarding angels was a direct attack on the Sadducees' rejection. They didn't believe in angels. They didn't believe in spirits. They didn't believe in the resurrection of the dead. That's a whole other sermon, though. Jesus' point, his point in saying that believers will be like angels isn't that we will be genderless. He's not saying that we will be non-physical. But what he is saying is that we will be deathless. We will be glorified. We will be eternal. That's what he's saying. There won't be any need for procreation. And what's one of the main purposes for marriage? Procreation. That is, furthering the human race. No. Contrary to Mormon theology that puts forth the idea that women in the hereafter are going to continue to bear these celestial babies, millions upon millions. Wouldn't you love to be a Mormon as a woman? That's what you're gonna do for all eternity. No. Completely contrary to biblical teaching. Heaven's population of people will be sealed by this life. It will neither increase nor decrease. And so, therefore, there's not going to be marriage in heaven. Now, I know for some of us who are happily married, this might seem to be a bitter pill for us to swallow. For those who are unhappily married, might be good news. Personally, I love it when Terry says to me, heaven's just not going to be the same not being married to you. But then again, what does she mean when she says that? But should the fact that there won't be marriage in heaven, should that be a cause for sorrow? I don't think so. Because the level of knowledge and intimacy and joy that heaven's inhabitants will have in one another will be deeper than anything that they have experienced in this life. Jonathan Edwards spoke lovingly of his own wife, Sarah. He was wed to her for over 30 years. They had 11 kids together. And he said this, "Give my kindest love to my dear wife and tell her that the uncommon union which has so long subsisted between us has been of such a nature as I trust is spiritual and therefore will continue forever." Spiritual. So, what started out again as another plot to discredit Jesus became yet another occasion for the Lord to display his majestic, matchless wisdom as he refuted these guys. No one else had been able to so succinctly and effectively refute the Sadducees as Jesus did. But in his presence, they were made to look like doofuses. And they were doofuses. And Jesus ends this episode, you can see in verse 33, by saying, when the crowds heard this, they were astonished at his teaching. They were amazed. They were blown away. Luke tells us in his gospel, he said that even some of the scribes answered and they said, "Teacher, you have spoken well." Even they had to admit that Jesus had answered well. They couldn't deny his incomparable wisdom. But here's the thing. Not only should you and I be amazed at Jesus' teaching, but again, we can be confident and courageous as we ourselves continue to age and break down and draw ever closer to our own departure from this life, knowing that there is a true resurrection hope that awaits those whose trust is in the Lord Jesus Christ. That as Jesus and that God was able to say, "For I am the God of Abraham, and I'm the God of Isaac, I am the God of Jacob, I am the God of Greg, I am the God of George, I am the God of," and you can fill in the blank with your name. That if you're in covenant relationship with him, your hope is everlasting. And we look forward to being rejoined one day to those of our dear brothers and sisters who have already gone on before us. Let's go ahead and stand. I don't know how people do it without resurrection hope. I don't. Well, praise God for the living hope that he gives us. Lord, thank you. You're the resurrection, life. He who places their trust in you, their hope in you, will not be disappointed. God, thank you. Thank you for the truth of your word, which is so powerful. And we can rely upon your word right down to the very verb tenses, knowing that you inspired those verb tenses to tell us truth that should guide our lives and give us hope. So thank you. Thank you for today. I love you, Lord, and I lift my voice to worship you. O my soul, rejoice. Take joy, my King, in what you hear. May it be a sweet, sweet sound in your